Okay, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks especially to Professor Robinson, Professor Johnson, and Professor Barber. These are my excellent, wonderful colleagues. We have a couple more books as well today. We have, well, we don't have Professor Barber's books here, but we have, they are on order. I can grab another one of those if anybody's interested. And we also
one, please.
What's that?
For Dr. Barber's.
Yes, absolutely, Martin. Coming up, that's in the works, and send me an email to remind me. We have books here by Professor Marc Robinson, assistant professor here in the history department, specializing in African American history. We also have books by Professor Diana Johnson, who's here, associate professor in the history department, also in the Department of Ethnic Studies, and Professor Cary Barber, who's joining us online on Zoom. Thanks, Cary. Books, a couple of books on back order from Professor Barber. And we're going to talk a little bit today about books. I know it's always really exciting for students to hear about their faculty's books, I think, and what it takes to get the book across the finish line. So from the beginnings, maybe these books started in the author's minds as early as when they were sitting where you're sitting right now. That may have been the beginnings of these books, and then they went through many, many iterations. It's a special version of a book that comes through the academic history, research, and writing process. And I'm really excited to hear about it. I gave our guests just a wide open prompt, talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. I did not ask for order, so any kind of order, so there may be a little bit of chaos right now as we talk about who wants to lead, who wants to say a couple words, if you have any thoughts, and or we can kick it open to conversation right away. Did anybody have anything they wanted to say at the beginning to sort of lead off and talk a little bit about books, or do you want to open it right up?
I think I'm looking at, Cary wants to jump in. I mean, it might be helpful for each of us to just talk about kind of the origin of our books, kind of how we got to the project. Dr. Barber, how does that sound to you?
I was going to say Hollywood Robinson. You got to go first, but yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the tortuous narrative that was the creation of this book. But I'm happy to hold off for you guys, whatever you want to do.
Okay.
Mark, do you want to start off?
People
away.
All right, go ahead and so I'll be back in 1 minute.
I'm okay with the water, by the way.
You sure?
Yeah, don't trouble.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, hello, everybody. Greetings to those of you who I've met before and for the new faces. As Dr. Murray said, history department, Marc Robinson here. This is my 6th year at Cal State San Bernardino. And I teach courses on African American history and related topics. So my book here, Washington State Rising, as Dr. Murray said, with his usual wisdom, it did start out as an undergraduate paper about 20 years ago, right? So about 2002 or so. I was a junior, senior in my undergrad. I was in history. I was a history major at the University of Washington, and for a variety of reasons, ended up wanting to do a paper on student activism on my campus, University of Washington in Seattle, in the 1960s. And so I talked to a professor who I took a class from on the 60s and kind of pitched the idea, and he said, sure, I'll sign off, you can do this independent research project. And so I sort of set off really with not a clear idea of what I would find. At that time, there were sort of rumors that there had been some student protests and something had happened. I had heard certain things in my family growing up about certain things that the political machinations of 1960 Seattle and the campus. But like I said, it was sort of rumor, maybe kind of half story detail here and there. And so I kind of sort of just wanted to see what I could find. I guess long story, a little bit shorter. I eventually finished the paper. I interviewed some folks, including Larry Gossett, one of the first people I interviewed, as Dr. Johnson knows, and discovered, wow, there's a history here. I was able to kind of document at least this key event where the Black Student Union in 1968 did a takeover of the president's office on campus and kind of had this confrontation, and that led to a number of reforms on campus. And so I think the paper was maybe 10, 15 pages, something like that, kind of a standard length research paper. I shared it with some of my kind of peers. I was a student in the Black Student Union at that time, researching the history of the Black Student Union. So I shared it with some of my fellow, activists and some other folks. And got some positive feedback from my professor and others. And that's more or less where it stopped. And how did it get from that to book, many years, decades later, is, as Dr. Barber said, a bit of a torturous story of, sometimes, it sort of went from that research paper to a kind of like small article, then to PhD dissertation, then to a scholarly journal article, then with a few other twists and turns, eventually to the book, and then, kind of book proposal and the book and all that. So yeah, all that took many years, many different revisions, adding different details to it, and getting feedback along the way from different professors and so forth. And so, yeah, that's sort of kind of how it all happened. And I can go into more details on any of that, of course, but for me, it started out with that just genuine curiosity and wanting to learn more about my hometown and kind of where I was going to school, kind of placing my own self to the history. And then it kind of continued on with sort of a sense of, I have a responsibility to do something with this now that I have a chance to kind of continue to study it. And then I think it was, sort of like the idea of having a book still is, the last point I'll make before I let my colleagues take over. Even as I was getting to like PhD stage and even beyond that, the book still seemed like a daunting, intimidating, challenge. And so a lot of it was kind of like taking a step, not necessarily knowing the final destination, but do your best, take that one step, and then once you can complete that, take another step, and 20 years later, you have a book. That's sort of kind of how I did it. So very much not the grand strategy. And if I went back to talk to my 20-year-old self and said, "You're gonna have a book someday," I would not believe I would have a book. I would not believe I'd be a history professor. All that was things that kind of came together over time. So again, I can expand on any of that if you'd like, but I will go ahead and turn it over to one of my colleagues.
I guess I'll go next because mine intersects with yours.
Okay.
Because when did you start working with Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project?
Yeah, that was like right after I graduated, so
Was it?
early 2000s. Yeah.
Okay, so I asked that because, Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project is a really cool website you can go to with a bunch of scholars, like housed at the University of Washington, and it hosts a bunch of articles and also oral histories that chronicle civil rights, labor history, racial progress history, coming out of Seattle, obviously. And that's where actually Dr. Robinson had written some articles for that project, and I didn't know him at the time, but I was reading his work, and it helped instigate actually my project as well, which is so funny because now we work in the same department. So, and he's referenced in my book and everything. And Larry Gossett, who he's mentioned, was actually the first person I interviewed as well. And then having him kind of in my corner, he helped me gain entrance to a lot of different networks and other oral histories that show up in my text. So we have a lot of interesting overlap. But yeah, I grew up in Washington State as well, which and different family dynamics contribute to why I was interested in this specific topic. I wasn't interested in or knew exactly where I was going in undergrad. It took going to grad school. I was originally always interested in Chicano history and African American history and the intersections between different communities. And my PhD advisor, by the time I went to UC Davis, said, why don't you just look around, what's going on with your home state if you're interested in, Chicano history is so centered in like California. She said, well, my dad's side of the family's from Mexico. She's like, well, what's going on with Chicanos up in your home state? And I said, okay, I don't really know. And then I delved into that history, and that's kind of the very specific foundations of my book. And then I started, a lot of it was Google and going through like Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project and finding snippets of like, Dr. Robinson writes about the Black Student Union, but within his book, Black Student Union was also very like coalitional and reaching across racial lines, which is ultimately what I wanted to write about. So I really followed and like delved deeper into that via that website. And then found that looking at Chicano history in my hometown in Seattle was also very coalitional. And I, ended up writing this book, of course, about multiracial activism coming out of Seattle in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the case study was very small. I started with Chicano history in Seattle, and then chapter 4 in the text is actually my master's thesis. So you can also see just in that work and like the different activists and names then that are in that chapter. Like then I started to dig into each one of those more, and that fulfilled or fleshed out the rest of the book essentially. So definitely like by the time I was where you're sitting, I was fortunate to find a topic that developed into my thesis and then had enough intersections and branches and networks to form the rest of my books. I really just like carried that forward. And I had a really good advisor, honestly, who tapped into that, who saw, okay, there's interesting stuff going on with Chicano history in Washington State, but like, why are people working across racial lines so much? Like, what is the root of that? And so she pushed me to like further develop that. And then I really feel like I found a treasure trove of sources, primarily at the University of Washington also. So it was somewhat torturous, very long. Started working on this project as far back as 2010 when I was in graduate school. Published, of course, 2023, so a very, very long time, obviously, as well. But I was able to do so much of my research at the University of Washington. I'm very fortunate to talk to and interview activists, but also have so many of the papers of these activists who were donated. So I was able to spend a concentrated period of time there interviewing people, but also have all of this access to, I think, really rich primary archival source things that you can see in the book. So in brief, that's how it developed. But I have always had like a personal also like connection because it was about my home state, and that also helped like drive the project forward and push it forward even when I hated it by the time I was finishing my PhD. So all in there for now.
Hating it at the end. Isn't that the way we all feel about this thing?
I like
10
that.
years from now, maybe I'll like this book, but who knows as it stands now, right? Hi everyone, I'm Cary Barber. I do mostly Roman history, as you can kind of see from back here. The way this book came out was, I always like wonderful to see the journeys that people take from their undergraduate to their master's to their PhD to their eventual book. I have plenty of friends who've done that. My story is totally different, and it sort of represents the kind of chaotic mind I have in here anyway. But the idea was I was working on my dissertation on this very particular period in Roman history, and what I found was a total lack of a kind of historiographic reflection in my field. That is, Roman history is one of the older fields of history, if we think about it in terms of sort of the modern study of history. And no one's really ever questioned those origins, and certainly not the way that they impact us today. And so I'm writing my dissertation, doing the historiography section, and I write this like ridiculous, like 120-page long chapter about this guy Theodore Mommsen and this idea of legalism, the idea that, say, law can really structure the way people actually act and behave historically. And of course, that's not really true. Everyone gives him this idea, but then I looked further into it and I found that it was much more nuanced and interesting. So I wrote this chapter. My advisor said, don't ever bring something like this to me ever again. Get back to work on the original topic and save this for the end of your career, essentially, right? That's when you write the big historiographic book. Well, so I sat on that for a while. I was lucky to have a friend in the field who I had done a couple conferences with, and that's actually really interesting and sort of it's a way to sort of network out a book topic. He was working on a new book series. It's this Brill's Research Perspective series on the ancient world. And he had asked me to do a kind of lit review in 80 to 100 pages about scholarship on a very specific topic, Roman politics from 230 to 130 BCE. I took that and then just started working on the historiographic section, which then ballooned and then ballooned and ballooned to the point where the first chapter of the book ended up becoming the book. So it was really this weird, I mean, this is the book I really wanted to write anyway. So it was always kind of there. I just used this as a springboard to do something much bigger. The book ended up being far longer, of course, than 100 pages. It ended up turning this research perspective series from a journal into a monograph series because I think me and some other guy did the exact same thing. And so as it was developing, I just kept bringing it to my editor friend and sort of pushing him to see, you know, okay, how about this? How about this angle? How about this angle? Can we instead focus on this? And yeah, I mean, it was great to have someone who was really excited about the project. I'll say also that I wrote this in part for me, for a grad student me who wanted information about this topic, the origins of the modern study of Roman history, say, and the way that impacts the way we think about it today. And I don't know, so there's an audience of at least one person, and that's some random grad student in Roman history. Nevertheless, as you can see, it's totally unplanned, uncharted thing that just grew organically. I'm not sure I'd really do a book like that again. That is in that particular way. I'm not sure I have it in me to do it again like that, but it was a really interesting period of sort of discovery for me, step by step by step, as I expanded on this investigation. So a little bit less structured in some ways than what you heard from Marc and Diana. An alternative way of doing it, not one I necessarily recommend. Anyway, that's the story. And again, I'm happy to push that farther, but that's my tale.
Thanks, Cary. Thanks, Marc and Diana. This is, you got us started with a lot of really interesting ideas. I want to open the floor for questions. I know I have a lot of questions to talk about. Martin, were you going to jump right in? No, then we didn't put you on the spot.
I can jump right in.
Sure, please go ahead.
So, Johnson, I wanted to ask, so like when you started working on you kind of shifted a little bit on your PhD. How much of a shift did you make? Was it like almost like, were you able to use a lot of your MA stuff in your PhD stuff, or like, because like for me, I cannot imagine myself starting my PhD like from zero, like where I have to like cultivate like source all over again. Because like I'm carrying my work throughout. So like, how was that experience for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, the bigger shift came in my undergrad, like capstone paper that got me into grad school was on it was comparative analysis of Chicana and African American feminisms. And then the biggest shift occurred, right, as I said with my advisor, she was saying, well, you always want to talk about why your work is adding something so new to the literature, right? So let's take Chicano history out of California, for instance, right? So that was the bigger shift. And then, like I said, though, my master's, obviously it went through a lot, but like the core ideas that I wrote in my master's are in chapter 4. So I was really fortunate in that way. It took many years of like revisions and everything. So the topic itself, like at its core, didn't really shift by the time I had conceptualized my master's thesis. What shifted was like, the through line is not Chicano history as it is in that chapter. It's like, how can we write a history about Seattle that's very multiracial? But even in the writing of my thesis, I realized like Chicanos, and that's in that chapter, are deeply always working across racial lines. So it's like it was a natural flow to them thinking about these larger networks. But a lot of the archival work that I was starting to do for chapter 4 shows up in other chapters. A lot of the names, then those specific papers were in the same repository. So I just went to those sites and then constructed the chapters. So without that guide of the masters, I don't, it would have been really difficult, so.
Yeah, I see that, like, even for myself, like, where, like, in my undergrad, I wrote about sterilizations, like, specifically, like, for women of color. And then in this book I'm writing about obstetric violence, so in general, so it's even wider than sterilization, so it could be, you know, contraceptivism and I feel like even for my PhD later in the future, it could be more about like eugenics and how like women of color were intersected with them, even like, so I see that for myself, like we're like an evolution where like at the end it encompasses something even larger than what I started with.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. So sometimes you start narrow and then you pull the strands out, is like how I visualize it, and then those turn into other chapters, but the core is there, so.
Yeah, I would add on that question too, so speaking from my experience, I guess I should revise what I said earlier. Looking back, it seems like, you know, dominoes that just kind of fell in a nice even row. But part of the, you know, journey were these different detours, which one of them being when I got to grad school, so I went from an undergrad straight into a PhD program. Wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but that's how I did it. And when I got there, I specifically applied to an interdisciplinary program because I wanted to have some flexibility. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do this BSU thing. But I actually put it aside for probably a good year and a half in grad school. And pursue this interest in kind of Black masculinity, kind of pop culture, kind of analysis. I was also reading feminist theory and some queer theory and sort of interested in, I was kind of thinking about like 1970s, 1980s, kind of Rick James, Prince, kind of Black presentation of gender and how, you know, was it pushing boundaries or not, and what was happening in these moments, and even early hip hop and
Sylvester.
yeah, I mean, so that's kind of what I was interested in, and there was a number of other interests that I explored. Looking back, I think that those, even though I didn't ultimately follow through in a book project on those other ideas, they did like inform my teaching in useful ways. They did inform my kind of overall development as a scholar and ability to kind of collaborate with colleagues or engage in interesting conversations. I have taught in Black studies or ethnic studies or even women's studies over the years. So it created maybe certain job opportunities. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think there is a value to doing it the way where, you know, the undergrad leads to the master's thesis, the master's thesis leads directly to the PhD leads directly to the book. There is a value to that. I'm also arguing that if you're not quite sure, or if you do take some detours, you know, you try this idea, try that idea, I want to argue that there's a value to that too. And, you know, within reason, you know, explore those other ideas and you might find some useful things come out of it. Even if you ultimately decide to come back to the thing you wrote about when you were in your master's program.
Yeah, I would totally agree with all of that. I did my honors thesis as an undergrad on something totally different than I did my MA on, which is totally different than the dissertation, which is in many ways totally different from the book. But I can say that at each step, everything I learned from those projects have come to inform the book itself, but also, as Marc said, the way we teach. And there's something really wonderful about getting this very broad, I mean, almost like a sort of parallel to the liberal arts education. You have this broad set of tools that you learn from any number of investigations that you can then bring to bear, not just on the book itself, but also the way you engage with the field, the way you think about problems, and the way you go about your pedagogy, which is also, of course, extremely important.
Hi, so my question more or less is regarding like your final like the final product of the book. So you guys went through the research, pretty much filled it all out. In terms of actually publishing it, is there any difficulties you guys have to go through with like publishers in terms of like royalties or copyright stuff? Or is that more or less kind of like, because you're producing like a more of like a scholarly book, it's not really present in that kind of stuff?
Yeah, good question.
Royal who? I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand. Are you saying you get money to do these books? What is happening somewhere? No, I'm just. But yeah, it's certainly mine was at least done out of the goodness of my heart. Certainly not for pay. But publishers can be funky. I will say just in my own experience. My publisher put the book out in September 2022 in the midst of the pandemic. Their distributors in North America totally fell apart without letting them know beforehand. So all of a sudden you just couldn't find the book. It looked like people were buying it left and right. Maybe not the case, right? They just simply couldn't get it anywhere. So there are, I mean, these sort of random struggles that you come to deal with. But you know, I don't know. Most of this is done. I think I can't speak for our other speakers here, but certainly this was just, you do research for its sake, I guess, to again, to benefit the field and of course to get promoted or whatever. But it's much more a labor of love than it is one that's going to be remunerative for you. Except for Mark. Mark's rolling in dough from this book. I mean, it's really kind of nuts.
I mean, yeah, you do want to do like general research, like what is a standard royalty, right? You don't want to also just say like, oh, I'm not gonna make any, you know, you don't want to be taking advantage of it for the standards of the academic, what that means, right? So I looked up like very briefly, what is the standard, you know, and then they do ask you to negotiate it and you can potentially negotiate a little higher, but is it a money-making project? No. And then in terms of copyright, like I will say one thing is important, like if you're doing, if you need IRB or you're doing like oral history like I do, you do want to make sure that you follow like proper procedures in terms of getting permissions, because that can be a copyright issue down the road. So depending on your research, if it's really contemporary or something, that is something to think about. You might do something you don't know about in your master's and you know, you have that research for years and years and then you run into an issue down the line. So do be prepared like very, very early. Something you might not think it make it in a book, you don't know if you're gonna write a book, cross those T's and dot those I's anyway. Good advice.
What does that look like, Dr. Johnson? When people challenge this down the road, I know Dr. Robinson said that you mentioned that some people that you had interviewed were reluctant after the fact, maybe, or
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit? I thought that was really interesting to hear from both of you about that experience you had.
Sure. So yeah, a couple of things. So in terms of the sources, I didn't have a copyright issue, but I had a situation where someone that I interviewed didn't like what I had written. Someone I interviewed, based on the interview, I later published a journal article, which later became part of the book. And the person was not pleased with what I wrote and was very unhappy. And it was a challenge because I was trying to be truthful and honest and respectful, but also I wasn't trying to offend anyone. And so it definitely led, when I was still on the book, then I tried extra hard to kind of reach out to my interviewees as I was writing it and get their comments on drafts or invite them to provide criticisms and so forth. The book came out last October, so around there. So it's only been 6 months or whatever. I haven't gotten a lot of negative feedback yet, so fingers crossed that was a lesson learned. But that's come up for me. I think that's what Cary's referring to. In terms of the original question, yeah, so for royalties, what one of my mentors told me, which I think has been true, is that in the academic world, historians, if you want to make money on the book, you can make money on speaking fees and promoting, and if you get people to bring you in to give talks, you could potentially get $1,000 a talk, maybe as much as $3,000, $4,000 an appearance. People who are really adventurous and book those, can make a decent amount of change. That's maybe the main way people make money. The book itself tends to be less lucrative, as my colleagues have said, in part because of the small amount of royalties, but also, other sort of, we're not writing bestsellers necessarily. So even like, I remember when I got my book contract, my mom was like, "Oh, wow, you got a book contract. So, that must be like, where's the check? Let's see, like, how much money did you get?" Like expecting to be in like an advance or something or some big, deal. I was like, "Sorry, Ma, there's no money. Like, I don't get an advance. There's no, yeah, it's not like a deal in that way." I think that's pretty standard, right? That it's not like the publishing for a mass audience, which is different economics, different compensation. Can I say a couple other things and then we'll come to you? So I want to say that about the royalties. One other thing I wanted to say about sort of challenges. I did have challenges with the publisher kind of as it was going through the final stages. So for one example was my title. I initially had a different title. My original title was Evergreen Ungawa. That was a reference to this common sort of phrase used by the movement. Ungawa, evergreen, references to the Pacific Northwest, and I was gonna sort of rip off this title, and I had this whole kind of what I thought was a poetic sort of, clever way of engaging the history. At some point, without really communicating with me, the publisher basically said, "No, we're not using that. We're gonna go with this title." And it did still lead to the bit of a clash where I was like, "Wait, what happened? Like, I was really invested in this one." I eventually kind of raised a bit of a stink, and that phrase still is in the book. It's in the introduction, so I was able to keep it. But some of those kind of decisions about edits or the look of the cover or choices about the title or even kind of deadlines of how quickly could revisions get back. I definitely had some struggle dealing with the publisher in terms of navigating some of those things. And at times it was frustrating and not fun, where they were, I thought they weren't as collaborative as I would have hoped. So that was the biggest challenge that I had kind of like in the last year or so of the process. But yeah, were you gonna ask a question?
Yeah, I have a friend who has published some romance novels. And she says that to get to a publisher, you have to have an agent. They won't touch you otherwise. Is that this also true in academic publishing?
That wasn't my experience. I haven't heard that in academia. I haven't heard that in academia from anyone. But there are like tricks to it, I think, like going to conferences and going to meet editors and acquisitions editors. They always have the book room there at all the conferences. That's how I met one of the first presses that I ended up not publishing with. And then my advisor, again, who's great, also, she had published with my publisher, UNC, and she actually connected me with her acquisitions editor. And that's how we started that communication, and then that ended up being fruitful. So you want to reach out to your networks, you want to network yourself. But in general too, like academic publishers, I feel like if your work fits well, they're actually going to seek you out to a degree. If they actually scan those conference presentation programs constantly and will a lot of times facilitate those conversations. So that's the most common way I know that people connect with an acquisitions editor.
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience to a degree. The person who became the editor for the series was someone who I presented with at various conferences, maybe 2 or 3 times. And so he reached out to me saying, hey, I know you just got out of grad school, you've done your general's exams relatively recently on this sort of wide-ranging topic. Do you think you could write something about it? So it was very much the result of, I guess, what we'd call networking, and also just kind of being present in the field. And frankly, it's nice when younger scholars look out for each other as much as the advisor, as Diana was saying, is critical, essential. I know that's true for a lot of people. In my case, this time it was instead just networking for the most part with an advisor who nevertheless was there to help with editing and ideas, etc. So I would recommend these kinds of events. Adding to your portfolio of people or whatever. That sounds like some business school nonsense. But anyway, I think is really important. It certainly wasn't my situation.
I would agree. I don't have an agent. Don't plan on getting one anytime soon. I think as you sort of progress in the academic world and, you continue on with your studies, through various networks of of relationships, oftentimes, editors will sort of reach out to you or you will find them in some way. So it's different, not as difficult to get a meeting if you're at that stage.
Yeah, I think, again, it's to the relatively small amount of money that's moving in this field so that you don't have people who are going to be go-betweens. The only exception I would say is a couple of speakers that I've tried to bring in had speaking representatives. And that's something that, as Professor Robinson said, if you have a book that is going onto the market and is going to be quite sought after, even if it is from a university press, and even if it is targeted for a relatively small audience, you may be very much in demand as a speaker for a specific audience at a number of different institutions, and they may have funds. So in those kind of situations, you may think about that, but I don't think it's necessary. Again, I've only come up against, I think, 2 out of a few hundred people who had speaking representatives. And then in terms of agents for the actual published work, the only time, and these weren't agents, they're more acquisition editors who feel a little bit like agents in the way that they are go-betweens, in the way that they're reaching out, in the way that they have these vast business school networks, as Cary said, these very big networks of people where they know lots and lots of people and they have their ear to the ground on a lot of things. They might be looking for people to do big textbooks, and that's where there's some money to be made. That's a rare place. But even those are often not from university presses, which is mainly what we're talking about. Some of those textbooks will be from Norton or McGraw-Hill or something like that. And that's where the money is. And so you start seeing representatives and that's. There's a question online, and Daniel, you should be able to unmute yourself and jump in.
Hey there, thank you very much, Dr. Murray. Sorry about that, I just had a quick question. But before I begin, name is Daniel Gutierrez, Dr. Barber, Dr. Robinson. I've taken both of your classes. Fortunately, I passed both of them. Dr. Barber, I think I took your class during the COVID times when it was Zoom only. Thankfully, you made the classes enjoyable as possible, even though I prefer in-person classes. But other than that, quick question for whoever's published a book before. Besides royalties or speaking fees, what other benefits are there from publishing? Like, for example, if a student publishes a book, could they receive more scholarships, or can published works increase the chances of securing a full-time job in academia?
Yeah, I mean, I think increasingly the academic job market is difficult and growing more difficult in some ways. The one way that I can sort of prove that objectively, I suppose, is that increasingly people have publications by the time that they are hired for their first tenure track job. You may not have a book, but certainly it helps to have a book contract if you're able to grab one with a publisher. When you apply for a tenure track job, it certainly makes things easier. Obviously, it's not a book in hand, but there's lots of benefits to having it as you go up. That's sort of the one potential benefit, I guess. It's also important for again, promotion internally inside your own university.
Okay, does that also apply when you say tenure track, does that apply to both community colleges and four-year universities?
I mean, the idea is that community colleges are supposed to favor teaching over research, and that's true also for regional public schools like ours. Nevertheless, like I said, I mean, you'll see people in community colleges with degrees from Princeton or whatever. It's kind of a wild world out there. And I'm speaking really, by the way, for ancient history, which is far less in demand, say, than the other fields of study that are represented up with Diana and Mark. Still, I'm sure that some of this goes the same way, right? It's helpful to have these things, no matter what university you're applying to. And I mean, it's even if you don't have to have a book out there, it's sort of nice to intervene in the discussion, the conversations taking place. And it's nice to see your work discussed, even if it's totally lambasted or poo-pooed or whatever. It's a pretty special feeling. So there is something personally gratifying about it for sure.
Yeah, so, yeah, in terms of other benefits, I mean, I think the last point, the personal fulfillment, you know, I mean, for me, it was a personal goal of mine to try to get it done, and so there's that, that's a benefit. In terms of, yeah, career-wise, I can speak mostly to the kind of college, university level. I don't have as much direct experience with the community college level. But yeah, in the college, you know, university level, so forth, particularly in our field, history, having a book is a strong kind of credential that you can get to earn promotion or earn other kinds of honors, tenure, scholarships, you know, they probably be called fellowships or other kinds of grants. But yeah, basically scholarships for professors, that those would, you'd be more competitive for applying for those. Even internally, like if I was to apply for money from the dean's office here on campus, they would see the fact that I've produced a book as something in my favor, as I, you know, applying for internal grants, and then of course external, you know, national humanities council or something is gonna, you know, look at it. So for those kinds of kind of direct career advancement things, and then more general kind of having good credentials in the field, or having, you know, kind of established reputation, so to speak. Those are all good reasons to have a book, kind of more intangible kind of benefits. All that to say too, I mean, we do have colleagues in our department. There are people across the country who are successful academics who don't have books. And, you know, who publish in other ways or do other kinds of scholarship, right? So it's not the only way, but it's a nice kind of shiny belt buckle if you can get one, you know, get the book out.
Yeah, I was gonna say similarly, historians are particularly wedded to the book. I think even that's softening depending on your teaching load. If you were on the tenure track, it's shifting a little bit at certain institutions sometimes. But yeah, people in here may have, you know, it sounds like do have intersecting interests. If you ended up in an ethnic studies or women's studies department, for instance, you might want to think about and talk to colleagues about how articles or multi-author articles, right, are privileged in different ways. So that's something I wasn't fully aware of too, that it's viewed in a very particular way, I think, in history departments. That is not true of a lot of the other social sciences.
Thanks, Daniel.
Awesome. All right. No, of course. Thank you very much, you three, for the fantastic answers. I mean, I still haven't figured out what my thesis is yet, but I mean, that's what I'm going to grad school for. So hopefully I can figure that out sooner than later. Thank you all.
Thanks, Daniel. Other questions from Zoom land or from anybody here? All right, I'm not gonna allow too much silence because I have a question. We talked, it's a little bit of a Bashar's point, and it is, you know, things are within sight, whether it's 18 months or 12 months, and you really need to focus. ideas about that, because I know for me, at that point, that's when like every squirrel of an idea distracts me. And I think, oh, I wanna do this, I wanna do that, I wanna do that too. Maybe I'll spend a week, working on that, but don't worry, I'll come back, I'll finish this later. Did you guys ever have that experience as you're sort of 18 months, 12 months out from finishing the book? Rather than as Bashar said, sort of opening up and doing many, many other things, really sharpening your focus. And do you have any, whether it's noise canceling headphones or any other, whatever it is? Because I know I also hear this from the students, and I have this question myself, or this challenge myself, finishing an article, finishing a book. Do you guys ever have that challenge, and do you ever think about it, and do you have any successful tried and true methods about how you sharpen your focus on a topic?
You mean like when it's already been accepted mostly though? Are you saying like 12 months out to like the
Yeah,
in hand?
Yeah,
Like-
it's been accepted, and you have these tasks with the manuscript, and you need to focus your efforts because all the sort of siren songs of a million new projects are calling to you, and you're excited about doing some, maybe I'm just talking about myself. Maybe you guys are like steel trap minds and you can keep the discipline, but I always find it's at that time when I know what I need to do. It's a little bit of drudgery.
Maybe you're
And
sick of it. at that
I'm
point.
sick of it,
Yeah.
and I'm ready to, for greener pastures. I'm ready for something exciting.
Well, I can say from my perspective, it might depend on where you're at career-wise, because I had the fear of not getting tenure. So like, I didn't feel like I had any space to consider new projects, I guess, but I might be a little more fluid in that if I think about a next book project and, that pathway. Yeah, by that point, I can say, and again, this depends on your publisher. I had really good, I think I had, looking back, I was really mad at the time. I had really critical reviewers who gave me really good concrete feedback of where to go and what needed to happen. And so I think that the press was great in that way, and my editor was great in that way. So I feel like I had very clear direction, and so that helped me hone in. And if I didn't have that, I think I would have reached out. My editor was great, so that's another thing, like pick someone who's, if you feel like you need it, which I did, who's hands-on, who's willing to answer questions, who's very accessible. So I feel like if I hadn't gotten that, I would have been able to reach out to him, and we talked many times on the phone, et cetera, and get more like concrete feedback if I needed it. So that kept me on track. I'm also like a Pomodoro person. I use the Pomodoro method. That's my like saving grace. That's the only way I got through it.
Can you explain
I
that to
had-
anybody who doesn't know what that is?
I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's time blocking, but it's like a specific type. So it's like 30 to 45 minutes of focused writing with 10 to 15-minute break. And the idea is it's something about your mind psychologically in that specific time frame, and then the forced break. So people will often say like, well, no, I have an idea, it's running, I need to go. But you're actually burning yourself out, according to the Pomodoro method, if you don't take the break. And so that's how I got through really the entirety of the book. And then I did physical writing groups where I sat with people in a room and we did the Pomodoro method together. We did that for like 2 years, and then we took breaks and chatted, and then we did that for like 5 hours.
So the writing accountability.
There was accountability, so I find that more useful to me than the ones where you get feedback on each other's work, because you're at such different fields often, or even within history, it's so, your projects are so different. But I needed to physically sit in a room with people that would judge me if I wasn't working. And then we did that, and I still use Pomodoro, and I swear by it, and yeah, so try it. It doesn't work for everybody.
I thought you said like the Pomeranian method.
Oh.
We have a Pomeranian dog in your lap.
You have to walk it it's gonna need to pee, right?
That's what I heard.
Well, so I also have a dissertation dog, who's now a book dog, who I bought while I was working on my dissertation, cooped up in my house, my little chihuahua, and sat with me while I worked. And that forces you to go out, and I had to give her breaks, and then now she's my book dog, so.
I thought you meant like pomodoro sauce. I was very.
So wait, there is a connection though. I can't remember what it is. That's something to do with the tomato.
It's a timer, I think.
There's a tomato timer,
I've
yeah.
heard of that.
I
Yeah.
think,
You
yeah,
set the timer and it's in the shape of a tomato.
so there is a connection to the tomato.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, well, I appreciate learning about this. I didn't realize there was a term for this, but but I did something similar where, you know, having like a regimented schedule, blocks of time, where I would kind of force myself to sort of focus in, and then kind of have breaks structured. So yeah, similar. I didn't do the 30-minute break exactly, but you know, similar kind of concept. So that I was gonna say something like that too, that's helpful to kind of get you to focus. I also, I mean, in terms of how to stay focused when you have other ideas that you want to run with, you know, as best you can to just kind of create like a list of like future projects, you know, I'd have my future project list and just kind of add to it and like tell myself I'm gonna come back to it someday. That can be helpful. You know, kind of, I mean, as Dr. Johnson was saying, you know, as you kind of go in the process, particularly when you're kind of maybe towards the end and you start getting feedback from your reviewers, in some ways that could be the most torturous as well as productive phase of the process. And they sort of force you to kind of focus, because, you know, they're gonna potentially give you, you know, 5 pages or whatever of, you know, notes and critiques. And you gotta figure out, well, what the heck do I do with this? Like, what are they telling me? And how do I, you know, incorporate this, you know, feedback? And, you know, you kind of try to let that sort of guide you. And so I think that's one thing that I didn't realize before that looking back, I would have kind of told myself to expect that, you know, you're gonna get that kind of constructive criticism along the way. And so you don't necessarily have to have the kind of perfect product when you first bring it to a publisher. It can still be sort of in development, but expect that you're gonna get that feedback. And then that can be the way you guide it to like the final product.
I would just add, so I think both of those are really good points. Like the one theme that seems to run across those, both Diana and Mark's points are, you know, there's like a saying written on the wall of the Temple of Apollo. It says "Nothi Sauton," which just means know thyself. I think the point being that you should reflect on what seems to be working for you in terms of how you write, whether it's Pomodoro method. For me, it's just I work really well at night, and so I just when no one else is around, and so I just try to do as much as I possibly could in the hours from like 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., which I would not recommend unless you are into that kind of thing. But that, you know, I just knew that was when I was at my most productive. And so that's what you end up having to do if you want to get this thing done. But I think that both of those, I mean, again, I'm not sure if any one of these is going to work for you necessarily, but certainly experimenting and trying out these different approaches was really helpful for me. And I think honestly, Diana's point is excellent. The writing accountability group worked really well for me the first year I was here, especially when we actually went on online for the pandemic. It kept me honest, at least during the hour or two I can actually get work done during the day. But anyway, that's my perspective.
Yeah, if there's anything, I actually haven't had a lot of success with writing accountability groups. So I'm maybe the odd one in that regard. But to your main point, right? Know yourself, figure out what works for you. Don't necessarily feel if someone else is having a lot of success in one way, it doesn't work for you, don't feel bad, figure out what works for you and go with that.
And it can change, but from an undergrad to a lot of you are in the master's program, from what worked as undergrads and got you A's the night before a paper was due will not work in the MA program. So remember that what worked at one stage won't necessarily work at another stage. So indeed, understanding those methods and what works and what doesn't work and what you need to keep working on. I don't want to keep our guests too much past the bottom of the hour, but if there are other questions, please from Zoom land or here.
As MA students, when do we start to panic?
Depending on what? Depending on what public live.
Never panic. You're starting now, so you don't have to panic. I think that there are a few things I just wanted to highlight that are so important that all three of you said. For the BA students here, but also the MA students. One is something that I think to a greater or lesser extent, all of you touched on, and that was the collaborative or social aspect of this. And it's a little bit counterintuitive when we think about history scholarship and the sort of monk in the ivory tower, whatever, how collaborative this can be between other scholars. And I think everybody touched on this. This is a real strength, and I've seen it as a great strength in the MA cohorts. So please, the earlier you tune into that, the better. One thing Mark said that was really cool was I think the phrase used was the responsibility of the project, having a responsibility of the expertise that you're growing in the project, and the responsibility of then putting that out into the world in the best shape and the clearest way that you possibly can. You're on this idea. This is yours. It becomes your field of expertise. I cited an MA thesis in a project I was working from Cal State Long Beach, a terrific MA thesis that was it was the only thing that dealt with that subject. So you're dealing with these topics, and you have a responsibility to do that. And as Diana said, there are going to be, as Professor Johnson said, there are going to be aspects of what you're doing now that will be in later iterations of the work that you're doing. I remember the best advice I got as I was finishing was somebody came, a guy who's left from political science. And I don't know if anybody ever told you all this as you were finishing, but they said, remember, this is your first book. I was like, oh, that's great. Like, now I can finish it. Yeah, I'm just going to send it out. But I was holding on to it and then didn't want to let it go. And he says, Donovan Chow was in the political science. It was like the best, simplest thing anybody said. Remember, this is your first book. So remember, this isn't the only thing that you'll ever do. And that can take pressure off. You're going to do lots of other things. You're going to maybe work in a museum, maybe teach, maybe work in a state national park, or do any number of things. And you're going to build on the work that you're doing here. But I remember that advice that, sort of this too shall pass kind of an idea. You will finish this. You will move past it. It will be a nice feather in your hat. But it's such a brittle feeling when you think, on the verge of finishing. It's so anxious, as Bashar said, when do we panic? It's more durable than that. It's going to be your work to the best of your ability, whether it's the thesis or the book that you turn it into, and then you'll move on. This has been really cool, and we should do this more often. But I'm really grateful to Professor Johnson, Professor Robinson, Professor Barber, for joining us. Do you all have any closing thoughts? Any Parthian shots? Cary?
I would say that steeling yourself for critique is actually a really useful kind of, at least for me, it was a place of growth for me over the course of writing this book. You're going to get feedback. It's not going to always, or even generally, be positive, whether it's from your friends, your reviewers, your editor, your advisor. But learning to deal with that critique, respond to it in a sort of positive way, noting that like people who are reading this are responding to you and they're interested, they're engaging with your work, whether it's positive or negative. That, I don't know, that to me has been something I had to really learn to deal with in the movement from PhD program to sort of out here in the world. And so if you can, get eyes on your work, get other people to look at it, respond to it before you publish, afterwards. That to me is, I think, been something I need to do more of, I suppose, and also a thing that I've learned to live with and be happy with. I had a terrible book review the other day by some German grad student. And I said, who cares? You know what I mean? That was a nice feeling too, by the way. Is recognizing that there's going to be both positive and negative responses to your work, and that really it's just about improving the field. Don't take it personally necessarily.
Yeah, what you were saying too made me think of a couple things, like evaluating yourself where you're at. So yeah, it's your first book, but even to, so that, I can see that being really helpful, but like even going back to an article or a dissertation, I remember when I was writing my dissertation, I was so freaked out because I was reading books instead of dissertations. And so like the difference between that, like surround yourself with what's actually what you're trying to produce. Once I started reading dissertations, I was like, oh, I can do that. Versus like, I was looking at like dissertation books are trying sometimes like 10 extra years of work. And I was thinking, I'm so far beyond that. And I got really freaked out. And then some of my friends too, even though we don't offer a lot of critique with each other, we'll just like share things in working stages so that you can see like my one friend said it's really helpful to actually see an article in its earlier forms when it looked awful. And that took down some of the intimidation. And then again, it's years and years of work, often as historians. So that helps me not feel as intimidated and yeah, reminding yourself of the stage that you're in versus like these final polished books, for instance.
That is so smart, by the way. I just thought about that, Diana. That's actually brilliant. Yeah, like why not? If you're doing an MA thesis, read MA theses to see what your sort of the milieu, the kind of expectations, etc. I think it's helpful as a way to find your own authorial voice, right? But I really like the idea that you should not be comparing yourself with the sort of, the big minds of the field, which we're mostly reading, right? As we prepare for these kinds of projects, that is an MA and dissertation. That's so smart, Diane. Something I would certainly recommend to everybody here too.
It helped me a lot.
Yeah, I would add that I kind of want to echo something that Dr. Murray said earlier, which is, he is obviously a, advanced scholar and is using master's theses in his work now. Similarly, in my book, I use at least one I can think of, but probably a couple master's theses as either I cited it directly or it led me to other sources and other things along the way, right? So the things that you're writing now, you're already making a contribution to the field. My takeaway of that is, if you want to write a book someday, the best thing you can do is do the best you can on the master's thesis, like sort of do that well, as best you can. Understand that that's part of the process of getting to that book, wherever that may come. Sort of focus on it, understand, value the experience, value the learning that you're getting from that experience. Kind of understand that it is a significant contribution to the field already. And then after that's done, and depending on how you feel about it and so forth, you'll decide whether you want to make that next step or kind of what the next step may look like. And then, you'll go on that journey, which will lead to the book perhaps down the road. I think for me, thinking about like book all at once, even as I'm maybe in a master's program or even a PhD program, for me, that would have been overwhelming. That would have been too intimidating. I would have been kind of paralyzed by, being daunted by the challenge of it all. So talking to myself back then, don't worry so much about, the final product as in book, do the best you can with what you got in front of you. And then you'll take the next step after that. That'd be my parting words.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Cary. That's great. I'm gonna close down the Zoom. Anybody who's on Zoom and would like to email me about possibly getting a copy of one of these books, please do so. It's easy to find me. If you got the email announcement about this event, you know where to find me. All right.